Well, now, I don't know who judges these things, but did you know that yet again, apparently, this year, London was crowned best city in the world? Okay? According to the website bestcities.org, so it must be right, they say this: as the capital of capitals, still waist deep in an opaque pandemic slurry, negotiates the uncharted, perilous terrain of post-Brexit world, London continues to reign the planet's best city for the 6th year running. Can you believe that? Aren't you proud to be British? And it gets better, actually, because another survey conducted by Which found that the happiest place to live in the East Midlands, okay, in the different categories, is Chesterfield. Happiest place in the East Midlands. Isn't that great? So in short, my fellow Chesterfieldians or Spirites, it is only downhill from here if you move away. Bear that in mind. If you're ever thinking of moving, you're just moving away from happiness. Okay? Don't do it. Now, Athens was an incredible place to live. It still is an amazing place to visit. It was already an ancient city, even in the days of the Apostle Paul when he visits there. It's ancient even in those categories. And it was full of art and full of breathtaking architecture. It was also a place that was absolutely full of ideas. Anybody who was doing any thinking was, their thoughts were making it to Athens. It was the birthplace of democracy. It was the home of playwrights and historians and physicians and philosophers. And as for religion, with the Acropolis, there it is on the screen there, the Acropolis towering out over the city, over the valleys there. It had its temples and its shrines. It had a religious infrastructure that could rival any city in the known world. Now, you may remember, if you've been coming to our series going through Acts, Paul's been escorted south. He keeps on moving south, down from Macedonia, and he's been delivered to Athens. And he's waiting in Athens, so we're told here, for the arrival of his colleagues, of Timothy and Silas. They're still finishing up in Berea, that little town further north. Now, this sounds like an exciting place to spend a few days, doesn't it? There's Paul, he's on his own, he's got a bit of a break, the boys haven't quite arrived yet. You'd think he'd want to just, get a kebab? I don't know what they have in Athens, get some of the local food, rest, perhaps sun himself on a beach for a bit. But that's not quite what he does it? Look at verse 16. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. John Calvin writes this. He says, the whole world was then full of idols. The pure worship of God could be found nowhere. And there was everywhere innumerable monsters of superstition. But Satan had made the city of Athens more mad than any other city, so that the people thereof were carried headlong with greater madness unto their wickedness and perverse rites. And this example is worth noting, that the city, which was the mansion house of wisdom, the fountain of all arts, the mother of humanity, did exceed all others in blindness and madness. That's what we see really here in the passage we've got in front of us. Now that first verse there tells us that when Paul saw the city and walked around the city, he became greatly distressed. I want to really sort of think about that for a bit this morning. The great distress of Paul. The actual word in that verse is this word paroxeno. It's a brilliant little word, paroxeno. It means more than just a bit distressed. It's got kind of two ideas behind the word. You've got the idea of anger bubbling up, and you've got the idea of grief. Imagine putting grief and anger together. That's how Paul's feeling as he walks around this tremendous city. One writer describes what Paul meets as he enters the city and looks around the city as being, he's amongst a forest of idols. So as Paul tours the city, he sees the temples. He sees the idols and the shrines, and it makes this pity, this anger, well up in his stomach. He's grieved. Here is a city that has sold itself wholesale to idolatrous things and idolatrous ideas, and they're blind and enslaved in satanic darkness. Here's a city where thousands are sliding into a godless eternity. That's how Paul sees it. They're deceived. All manner of wicked lies are coming in through their ears. And he's moved deep down by what he sees. He's angry at the demonic influence that this idolatry has over people. Deeply saddened, blindness, lostness all around him. Without hope and without God in the world. That's how he describes another Turkish city. Now this morning I want you just to think then, as we look at this, what is it that moves you like that? Do you get moved like that when you look around at the world around you? As a Christian, are you moved? Do you sometimes look at things that people are living for, that people are pinning their hopes on? And do you despair when you see where it is that they've put those hopes? No regard for God, no thought really of eternity, just trying to ignore it. Filling their lives with substitutes like money and sex and pastimes and possessions. Do you sometimes listen to the media around you? You know, watch the box sets, watch the TV, listen to the radio, and get angry when God is warped and misrepresented, maligned, dismissed. When God becomes replaced by so-called reason. We've got reason now, so we can throw out all of that God stuff. We mustn't become desensitized to this as we see it in our world, must we? Because often we see and hear this stuff so much that it becomes a background noise, and we don't really care too much, I think, sometimes about it. But it ought to tear at our hearts. We too should be peroxinode, or whatever the word is, greatly distressed. Now, Paul's a man of action, so he's got to do something. Yeah, he's a bold person. He's a great example to look at. We've already seen how we're supposed to follow his example. But look at what he does, verse 17. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and with God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace, day by day with those who happen to be there. So every day, Paul's getting himself over to the synagogue because he knows how that works. And he's reasoning in the synagogue with people as he normally does. But then, as soon as that's over, he's down to the marketplace. He's talking to anyone who will listen. Look at verse 18. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to dispute with him. I don't know about you. If they started to dispute with me, I'd just say, I'm going home. But not Paul. And some of them asked, what is this babbler trying to say? Others remarked, he seems to be advocating foreign gods. They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. That is Paul's response to all of this that he sees. But now, strap your seatbelts on, because whenever we do anything to do with Greek philosophy, I'm like, whoa, okay, let's be careful here. But I want to just go and just try and get to grips a little bit with what's going on in Athens. So I'm going to fill you in a little bit on these guys, these Epicureans and Stoics. These are the kind of worldviews that underpinned the Athenian culture. And as we go through this and just try and get to grips with it a little bit, I want you to be asking yourself, do we still see these ways of thinking in our world today? How much have we actually changed? So first of all, Epicureanism. So the Epicureans believed that pleasure is the highest good to be aimed at in life. It's all about pleasure. And pleasure for them is basically a state of trouble-free tranquility. So it's Hakuna Matata, isn't it? Yeah? And therefore, if you want this pleasure, this contentment, you have to avoid excesses because there's a price to be paid later. So just because I'm a pleasure seeker, I'm not going to go so far I'm going to get a hangover the next day. Yeah? I want to avoid that. This tranquil happiness comes at a cost, though, of if I'm going to get this, I've got to withdraw myself from too much involvement in the world. I don't want to be involved in the rough and tumble of life. I'll move away from that to seek my pleasure elsewhere. So you can already start to see it's not really the kind of philosophy of the working man, is it? Who can just take himself off somewhere and not worry about, this is someone who's got a bit in the bank account, haven't it? The Epicureans. According to their philosophy, we are not answerable to a creator who cares how we behave. So there might be gods, but they're just creatures like you and I. And by the way, the gods themselves are also presumed to be Epicurean, right? So they don't really care what's going on with man. They're just seeking their own contentment and pleasure elsewhere. The gods live a trouble-free life of enjoyment, and we're supposed to follow their example. Amazingly, and this is quite cool really, they had a sophisticated view of matter, they tell us. So they believed that matter was made of atoms. That's pretty cool, isn't it? They can't see them, but they believed it. The gods, you see, dwell in the spaces between the atoms. Can you picture this? It's mind-blowing stuff, isn't it? The atoms originally, you see, all just fell and showered, apparently, and piled up in piles in the universe. The flow that gets into piles might become something. So that's where everything has its origin, just falling matter and chance. Everything's a product just of matter, really, when it comes down to it. It's a combination of atoms, even including the human soul, they would say. So there's no creator. And therefore, you don't have to worry about judgment or consequences in the next life. No punishment, no hell. Because of this also, necessarily, there's no justice. Not really, no ultimate justice for millions. No satisfactory answer to evil. And that's another reason to just detach from life. Do you see any of these things in our world today? Is Epicureanism still alive? And then you've got the Stoics, okay? So whenever you've got a movement like this, you've got a reaction to it, haven't you? Because people just like to disagree with each other as much as anything else. So the Epicureans, they opposed the Stoics, they opposed the Epicureans, and especially the whole setting up of pleasure of whatever kind, that being the chief end of life. No, they're not into that. They're going to be Stoic. We kind of know the word, don't we? The chief aim, according to their philosophy, was to live in perfect agreement with nature. Is this ringing any bells? To be virtuous. The Stoics would have produced T-shirts that would have said things like this: there's a spark of the divine in us all. We want to be a citizen of the world. I'm a citizen of the world, yeah? I'm part of the brotherhood of all mankind. That's the Stoic. And virtue for them is the only good in life, to be lived in harmony with reason. Lack of virtue is the only evil. So the virtuous life, and this is interesting, the virtuous life is, I've got to be free of all passions. I don't want to be a passionate person. I'm going to keep that under control. Because passions are intrinsically disturbing and they're harmful to the soul. Passions, you see, when you care too much about something, it leads to expectations. And expectations lead to inevitable disappointments. And I don't want to deal with that. So better to have an even keel. Don't expect too much. Don't care for too much. Just deal with life. When bad stuff's happening, it's good to resist it. But when it happens, you just got to steel yourself, get your emotions under control and accept it. Keep calm and carry on, right? As a philosophy, Stoicism produced people that were very courageous and had fine character. They were good, moral people. Rather than the Epicurean view of creation being sort of this chance arrangement of atoms, the Stoics believed in fate and in providence. They believed that at the heart of the universe there was reason. There was some sort of vital force that, is connecting everything and involved in it and working on behalf of the whole. And so that made them pantheists. So have you ever seen the film Avatar? It's that sort of idea. Yeah, all plugged into this blue stuff. Well, maybe not blue, but the stuff that's just pervading everything. Now, Athens, you've got all of this going on, these two sort of schools of philosophy, and then on top of that, with this whole melting pot of philosophy, you've got the average bloke who doesn't want to do all that much thinking. I probably would have been in this group, I've got to say. And so running in parallel with this highfalutin philosophy sort of stuff, you've got the pagan idol worship going on. Just the standard stuff, the religion of the state, basically. And fundamental to that is the principle of keeping the gods happy. You do that with the way you live and the offerings that you make and money you give and all of that sort of stuff. Keep them happy. Keep the gods sweet, because then they will bless you. I think perhaps today we might call that superstition, right? So you've got all of that going on. And as Luke tells us in verse 21, so picture this culture. All the Athenians and foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. Now, I assume that's a bit of an exaggeration, but you can imagine this culture. I mean, they're just anything that's posted up on YouTube or Snapchat or any of these things. The latest idea, this meme, they're just that obsessed with it. The phone is always out and they're flicking through it. They just want to, the latest idea. And so in summary, at heart, this is a world full of people desperately trying to navigate through life, aren't they? And they're working everything out around them, really, essentially, to their advantage. That's what they're doing with all of these different approaches. They're desperately seeking fulfillment, advantage, contentment. Has anything changed? The forms might have changed. The heart is still the same today. And when these people initially heard what Paul had to say, there was this mixed response. Look at it again in verse 18. It's the sort of, what's this babbler trying to say? And others are remarking, well, he seems to be advocating foreign gods or something. The word babbler there, it literally means this seed picker. You're supposed to get the idea of this bird that flutters around, pecking a seed up here, and then flutters around, pecks another seed up here. And it all just sounds a bit weird and eclectic to those who are hearing him. This Paul bloke, he comes here from the east with his foreign gods, and he's cobbling together some sort of patchwork religion, and some of it sounds familiar, and other bits of it are just a bit weird. There's a bit of Judaism in there, I recognize that. There's a bit of philosophy, there's ideas here, there, and everywhere. My head's spinning. And so, because what Paul is saying is interesting, well, they invite him to address the Areopagus. Now, this is the hub of where everything's going on in the thinking in Athens. It's a hill just across from the Parthenon, overlooking the marketplace, an imposing lump of marble with steps carved up the side of it. And the thinkers, and as Luke calls them, the lovers of novelty, well, that's where they sit and have their lunch and their cup of tea and chat together. So verse 19 then. May we know what this new teaching is that you're presenting, they ask. You're bringing some strange ideas to our ears. We want to know what they mean. And what follows in our text is just the highlights, really, of what Paul says to them. But his approach and the central points of Paul's presentation, I think, are really helpful for us today, because we live in this crazy melting pot kind of world. All these weird thoughts about life and eternity. Well, I love the way that Paul starts here. Let's have a look at what he says to them. This is the meat, really, of what we've got in the passage. And Paul's got his way in with this eclectic group of people. He's got it all sorted. Look at the genius of what Paul does. First of all, a little compliment. He's going to hook them, okay? Look at the hook. Men of Athens, he cries. I see in every way you're very religious. Yeah? What a religious group. And now some light humor, perhaps. Verse 23. As I walked around and looked at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. Man, you guys, you are incredibly religious. Brilliant. And then his way in. Now, you lot, with all your religion and your unknown religion, what you worship is something unknown. That's what I'm going to proclaim to you. That's what I'm all about. It's an engaging introduction, isn't it? Especially to this kind of crowd who just want to know stuff. I actually think he's got everyone's undivided attention. So how's he going to get them to the truth of the gospel? Let's look at it briefly. He starts, so I've got 5 points here. You could probably pick more out than that. But he starts, at the very least, by laying some foundations. This is what Paul thinks is really important. It's really dealing with the question of, what do I mean when I say God? That's a pretty good place to start, isn't it, with a conversation with people, isn't it? What do I mean when I say God? First point, then, is there is a creator God. There's an uncreated creator who is God. Verse 24, the God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and he doesn't live in temples made by hands. Okay? So creation's not a chance occurrence. It's not just a piling up of atoms just scattering through the universe. And there's not an impersonal, interconnecting force of reason just holding everything together. No. The difference between the God of the Bible and all other gods is the difference of creator and creation. That's a brilliant way of just getting people to understand what we mean when we say God, isn't it? Every other God you want to throw out there, people want to say, you Christians, you're just out to lunch. I mean, really what you're advocating is basically you're the kind of people that if you'd lived a few years earlier, you'd believe in Thor, wouldn't you? And you've got all of this sort of stuff going on, Santa Claus and Thor. No. Those are created. The God we believe in, he's uncreated. That's the God of the Bible. Now we're clear. Now we know which God we're talking about. There's a personal God, a God who rules his creation and rules over everything that exists. And if that is so, says Paul, look at the conclusions. It's absurd to think that the God who supervises and runs the universe might be contained in a shrine or a temple. Ridiculous to believe he's limited, localized, or confined to a building. Second point then. So we know which God it is we're talking about. Secondly, what's more, this God is actually the sustainer of all life. That's quite important. Look at verse 25. He's not served by human hands as if he needed anything, because he himself gives all men life and breath and everything else. That's what you need to know about this God. We depend on him. He doesn't depend on us. He continues to keep all life going. That's the God I'm proclaiming to you. Every heartbeat, every breath you breathe depends on him. This is not a God who created a universe like clockwork and wound it up and then went off to do something else. No, he doesn't dwell between the atoms. No, without him, the atoms of the universe would just fall apart. He's holding it all together. It's absurd then to think that the sustainer, the one who holds it all together, needs the help of those that he's sustaining to sustain him. You can't domesticate the true God. You can't keep him as some kind of a pet needing your provision. You can't manipulate him. The whole idea is mad, this whole pagan idea. And yet, we look at that and that sounds quite clear to us, doesn't it? Yeah, as Christians, we sort of think, yeah, of course, that's the Christian God. But how many of us, maybe even here in this room, treat God a bit like that? Like he is some sort of creation. Like if we do the right things for him, yeah, if I just got my quiet time sorted every day, if I just did that, well, he'd be better disposed towards me, wouldn't he? Can I just say that's the cornerstone of pagan religion? I'm not saying don't have your quiet times. I'm just saying don't believe in a God like that. Go to him because you love him. Don't go to him because you think somehow by stroking him, the genie will come out of the lamp. No, that's pagan. Third thing, really important, is that he rules, and this is an important point for the Athenians, he rules all the nations. Verse 26, look. From one man he made every nation, that they would inhabit the whole earth, and he determined the times set for them, the exact places where they would live. And God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out to him and find him, though he's not far from each one of us. For in him we live, move, have our being. In other words, this answers really what they were saying down in the marketplace, doesn't it? Paul's not advocating foreign gods. This is not foreign gods. This is not, you're way too small here. This idea that they had in the ancient world of territorial gods, When Paul, in the next chapter, is going to go to Ephesus, you've got these shrine makers who, they're crying out about Artemis, the god of the Ephesians, because they kind of owned him. He's in their territory. No. This is the God of all the nations. This is the one God before whom all people are accountable. It's not a case of you born in Britain, that's why you're a Christian. But, if you had been born in the Middle East, well, you'd be a Muslim, and Allah would be your God. No. You can't take your pick like that. He made all men from one man, Adam. He doesn't belong to any culture or people. They belong to him. That's the God we're preaching. And according to verse 27, it is actually the duty, of all people to seek him. You should all be seeking him. The word seek here actually carries the idea of just fumbling around and looking for something. That's the idea. Like a blind man searching in the dark, wanting to verify by contact, by getting their hand on this thing. And unfortunately, though we should all be doing that, we don't. Because of our sinfulness, we don't seek God. In fact, we prefer to suppress the truth. We were just looking at it, weren't we? From Romans chapter 1 in the children's talk. We prefer to suppress the truth about God, though it might well be obvious. We just grope for it, or don't even try to grope for it. We would rather dictate God than discover God. That's the human heart, isn't it? You think about it. We'd rather say what God is like than actually go and find God. And hence mankind must always grope around in the dark regards God unless their eyes are opened. And yet, to be clear, despite our blindness, says Paul, he isn't distant or unknowable or uninterested. That's the point Paul's making here. We distance ourselves from him. We try to shove him away, pretend he doesn't exist. Yet verse 27 says, he's not far from each one of us. And in him we live and move and have our being. When we look at creation, we saw it, didn't we? Something within us stirs and we kind of know this is right. And we're going to react to that. We've got to force it out of the way. We want to suppress it. It's not that it's not clear. He's knowable because he's revealed himself to us. So Paul continues, look, as some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring, verse 28. And therefore, since we are God's offspring, we shouldn't think of the divine being as something made of gold or silver or stone, an image made by man's design or skill. This unknown God, the creator of all, is in fact, fourthly then, the father of all human beings. What an interesting point for Paul to bring home. Do you ever tell people about that? What does he mean? But Paul actually quotes two of their own prophets in this, because there are glimmers and flashes of truth that mankind can find. And so he can quote these people. And they've figured something out. The thinkers of the day, the poets of the day, they've hit on something, says Paul. They're right here. We are, all of us, God's creatures, receiving our life from him. And so in a sense, we've originated from him. It's something we know on some level. And so it's absurd to think that God is like an image of gold or silver or stone which came from the imagination of man. No. Actually, it's the other way round. We are made in the image of God. God isn't made in our image or in an image we like to conjure up. No, we are made in the image of God. That's the madness you see of idolatry. It actually turns it upside down. Mankind becomes the originator, the sustainer, the creator of God. That's not the God that we're preaching. And so, having dismantled a collection of worldviews and philosophies, Paul now moves in with his final blow. And this is where we have to get with the gospel, isn't it? Look at what he says in verse 30. I mean, this is where everything starts to turn sour. They're probably really intrigued by what Paul's got to say up until this point. And then he says in verse 30, in the past, God overlooked such ignorance. But now he commands people everywhere to repent. For he set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he's appointed. And he's given proof of all of this to all men by raising him from the dead. I mean, that's just a step too far, isn't it, for the people? But his fifth point is this, and he makes no bones about it. This God I'm preaching to you is the judge before whom all will one day stand. The Athenians had admitted their ignorance about the God that they didn't know. Do you see that? He's the unknown God to them. They don't know everything, despite all their intelligence. And Paul has agreed. He's shown them just how little they know the real God. But he concludes the matter by declaring that now you've heard, there's no excuse for such ignorance. And if you willingly remain in the dark, in blindness, you're going to do so by your own choice from this point forwards. That's what he's saying. You are now culpable because I've revealed this God to you. I've told you about him. Up until now, God's overlooked that kind of ignorance. I mean, it's quite amazing language to be using in front of the Areopagus in all of their great wisdom and knowledge. To say, no, I've shown you your ignorance, your own self-confessed ignorance, and I've shown you how ignorant it is. By overlooked here, Paul doesn't mean that God didn't notice or that God has dismissed this ignorance, but rather that God's judgment against that ignorance has been held up and held back until this point because God is patient. But now it's different. Now you must turn. Now you must repent because judgment is coming and it's urgent that you do so. When Paul wandered into this city, he was deeply distressed because here were a people heading totally unprepared towards a great and terrible day of judgment. That's where he's got to in his presentation. I mean, notice just some of the details about that judgment. It's worth just seeing it. It's a universal judgment. He will judge the world because he's the God of the world. The whole world, every culture, land, people, the great, the good, the rich, the poor. No one will escape from the Creator because you can't run or hide from the God that made, sustains, knows everything. And it will be a just judgment, says Paul. Everyone will get total, just, final judgment. The wrongs done against you, yes, they'll be settled, and likewise all of the wrongs that you have done. Justice will be done. And the uncreated Creator, the one who witnesses everything and knows every deep, dark secret of your life, he will finally bring all of it to light and do justly. And it will be definite, says Paul. He's almost saying here, isn't he, the clock's ticking, people. He has set a day. The day is set. A day of final judgment, universal judgment. And the coming of that day, Paul finally says, and this is really what turns them off, isn't it? The coming of this day is definite because the judge is the one who's been raised from the dead. I mean, really, he's kind of saying here, look, if you don't like this idea of judgment, okay, if you want to try and just sort of get rid of this idea of judgment, all you've got to do is prove the resurrection didn't happen. Because if it did, there's a judgment coming. Now listen, I don't think this sermon here is recorded to give us an outline for preaching to Athenians or philosophy students, okay? I don't think that's what this is here for. It's very helpful, isn't it? But in fact, according to one source, this would have probably have taken about 3 to 4 hours for Paul to address the Areopagus. That's how long they would meet for to listen to somebody. What we've got here in Acts 17 is some bullet point summaries to help us think things through, isn't it? I'm sure Paul went into detail in every point that he spoke about. I'm sure he talked about the cross and explained Jesus' death as our substitute to pay for our sins. What we've got here is, I think, Paul's response, according to Luke, to the big issues on the ground in Athens. He explores the city. He speaks with the people. He goes to the marketplace. He talks to the common man. He disputes with the philosophers and the educated. He visits the places of worship. He reads their literature. It's all very instructive to us, isn't it? He's let their culture, their world, get under his skin to the point that it angers him and pains him. And so what we have here in these little sermon notes here is Paul debunking Athenian religion and philosophy. His best attempt at dismantling a blind and foolish philosophy of the world around him. So Epicureans, look at it. We are more than just a chance arrangement of atoms. We owe our being to a personal creator. A creator who's not like the idols in your temples or the gods in your pantheon. You need a new category, a personal, involved creator. Not himself part of creation, but one who designed and sustains you and who brings meaning to all parts of your life, even the suffering in your life, and one who will judge the world justly. So Epicureans, be warned, repentance is necessary. You need to repent while there's still time. And Stoics, the creation's not driven by some impersonal force, by fate or providence. There's a knowable creator. You're not part of the divine, but God is very close to you. In him you live and move and have your being. You're groping in the dark, but the God who made you is the Father who longs for you to repent and be spared from the judgment coming. And you, religious idolater, think, how can the God who sustains your very existence be contained or housed or provided for by you? How can an object crafted out of gold or silver, made from your imagination, ever possibly portray the God who formed you? Leave those childish idols behind. The God I proclaim made all men, and he's the God of all the peoples of the world. Do you see, Paul is answering their objections, removing the blindness of the world that he wants to preach to. So really this morning, I just want to ask the question, what about you and me? I mean, how do we do this? Are we deeply disturbed by the world around us? Do you walk around your town or your neighborhood, absorbing the sights and the sounds each day, and just nothing more, go to bed and just try to forget about it? Does the news and media of our world just wash over you? You know, you watch that new box set and you sort of have this niggling feeling behind you. This is just it's not quite right, is it? I wonder if there's an agenda they're pushing here. Or does it really trouble you? Do you talk about it? Do you know the world that you're trying to reach and that you've been sent to make disciples of? Their way of thinking, their philosophies of life. What about your friends, your colleagues, your neighbors? Have you tried to figure out what they think life is all about? Have you watched what they watch and listened to what they listen to? And I don't just mean for entertainment, but have you thought about what they're imbibing every day and where it leads? How can you answer them? We really need to put some thought into that, don't we? And we've said this before, but Christians they're very much like boats. They shouldn't be sat in the dry dock. That's not what a boat is for. A Christian, like a boat, needs to be out in the water. A Christian needs to be out in the world. We need the world all around us. We need to hear what it's saying. We need to see what it's doing, and we need to process these things so that we can give an answer. You don't want to let the water into the boat, obviously. You keep the water out there. And some of us, I'm guessing, might need to operate the bilge pump just a little bit and get some of that water out. But you must engage with the water. We're not to be a church that just sits separated from the world around us. We've got such good news. No one is going to listen if it just sounds like so much babble and we never really get to grips with the world around us. So does this world trouble you? Are you distressed by the world around you, by their plight? I know some of you are. This world is groping in darkness, so what will we do? By and large, Chesterfield's just heading for a godless eternity, isn't it? They need to know about Jesus. They need the light of the world to shine in the darkness. And that's the call of the book of Acts, isn't it? To be those who do that, who follow in the footsteps of those first messengers. So what will you do this week? What will you do to engage with your culture? Not just sort of to enjoy it, but to engage with it and think about the culture so that we might reach them for Christ.